I used to park my car near an old cemetery due to certain reasons you'll soon understand. One foggy morning after work, I decided to head home to get some rest. It was supposed to be a day like all the others. I'd simply park my car, walk a short distance, and land on my bed as soon as I got home. But little did I know that there was someone out there mapping out their next move, and for some reason, I was a part of the plan. This happened in December of 2015, back when I was living for a while with my grandmother in a small town in California. At that point in my life, I was constantly moving back and forth between California and Nevada, trying to figure out work and school and where I actually wanted to settle. During that winter, though, I stayed with my grandmother for several months while things calmed down. Though she lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex called Maple Terrace. It was one of those places designed mostly for older residents, with simple buildings, tidy sidewalks, and a small courtyard garden in the center. After my grandfather passed away, she lived there alone. Technically, the housing program that allowed her to stay there required that she be the only official resident. Because of that, I couldn't exactly advertise the fact that I was living with her for a while. We kept things low-key. One of the small inconveniences of that arrangement was parking. Residents had assigned parking spaces inside a gated section of the complex, and management kept an eye on unfamiliar cars. To avoid questions, I usually parked about half a mile down the road along a quiet residential block near an old cemetery that was a short walk away from the apartment building. It sounds unsettling when I describe it like that, but most nights it never bothered me. The walk was short, the neighborhood was quiet, and I actually enjoyed those peaceful moments after work. Around that time, I had picked up a seasonal job at a large toy store called Holiday Junction. It was right in the middle of the December shopping rush, which meant the store was constantly crowded, and afternoon shifts ended up being stretched into late hours. I had always struggled with social anxiety, so retail during the holiday season was honestly a big challenge for me. But I told myself it was good practice and an opportunity to get used to talking to people and handling stressful situations. Most nights I worked closing shifts. Closing didn't really mean closing, though. Even after the store doors were locked, employees stayed an extra hour or two organizing shelves, restocking displays, and cleaning up the mess left behind by holiday shoppers. One night in early December, I ended up working until a little after 2 a.m. By the time I stepped outside, everywhere was covered in fog. If you've never experienced winter fog in some small towns in California, it can be surprisingly intense. The air fills with this heavy, low mist that hangs close to the ground and makes everything look blurred and distant. Driving home that night felt like moving through a gray tunnel. I kept my headlights on the brightest setting and still couldn't see more than a few car lengths ahead of me. When I finally reached my neighborhood, the streets were completely empty. The only parking space available was near the far end of the road. Almost exactly where I usually parked anyway. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and sat there for a minute, the way I often did after long shifts. It was a small ritual I'd developed. After work, I liked to sit quietly for a moment, stretch my shoulders, and mentally complain about the night before heading home. Sometimes I'd mutter things like, "What a shift," or "I'm exhausted," just to let the stress out. That night, I did the same thing. I grabbed my bag, turned on the flashlight on my phone, and stepped out into the fog. The beam of light barely reached a few feet ahead. Still, the route home was simple. I just had to walk past the cemetery entrance, follow the sidewalk along the road, and turn left toward the apartment complex. I had done that walk dozens of times, but only a few minutes after starting, I heard something behind me. A cough. It was rough and raspy, the kind that immediately tells you someone has been standing in cold air for a while. At first, I assumed another person had just parked nearby and was heading home like I was. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow at first, but then they started getting faster. Goosebumps appeared all over my skin. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I simply picked up my pace slightly and kept walking. The footsteps grew louder. Then I heard a low whistle. It wasn't a cheerful tune or anything casual. It sounded deliberate, and almost like someone trying to make sure they had my attention. That was enough to get my heart beating in an erratic way. I started walking faster. Behind me, the footsteps sped up too. A moment later, I heard heavier breathing, uneven and strained, like someone pushing themselves to keep pace. At that point, my instincts took over. I broke into a run. The fog blurred the streetlights into glowing circles as I sprinted down the sidewalk. My heart was racing, and the sound of footsteps behind me grew sharper with every second. That's when the cemetery gate appeared through the mist. To this day, I'm not entirely sure why I chose that direction. Maybe my brain thought it offered somewhere to hide. Maybe I just panicked. But instead of continuing straight towards the apartments, I turned sharply and slipped through the open entrance. The cemetery was surrounded by tall iron gates and old stone markers that stretched in neat rows across the ground. In the fog, everything looked pale and ghost-like. I crouched down behind one of the stone pillars near the entrance and tried to control my breathing. For a moment, everything went quiet. Too quiet. Then I realized the footsteps had stopped too. Whoever had been behind me was nearby. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening carefully through the foggy silence. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Then a voice spoke from somewhere just outside the gate. "I know you're there." The tone wasn't loud. It was calm, almost casual, which somehow made it more unsettling. A second later, I heard the soft flick of a lighter. The faint smell of cigarette smoke drifted through the air. For some reason, that moment felt like my opportunity. While the person outside the gate was distracted, I slowly crept deeper into the cemetery, keeping low and moving between the rows of stone markers. After putting some distance between us, I stood up and ran again. The fog made it difficult to see where I was going, but I knew roughly where the far edge of the cemetery was located. Different sections of fencing surrounded the property. The front had tall iron gates, the sides had older wooden fencing, and the back was lined with a simple chain-link barrier near the street where my grandmother's building stood. That was my goal. I ran until I reached the fence and dropped to the ground. I remembered that the bottom of the chain-link fence didn't quite reach the soil. There was a small gap beneath it. I pushed the wire upward with one hand and slid underneath. The metal scraped against my jacket, and dirt covered my hands, but I barely noticed. The moment I cleared the fence, I jumped up and sprinted across the street toward the apartment building. When I reached my grandmother's door, I knocked as hard as I could. The porch light came on almost immediately. She opened the door, surprised to see me out of breath and shaking. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. For several minutes, I couldn't even explain what had happened. My heart was pounding too fast to speak clearly. Eventually, I told her the story. To this day, I still don't know how that person realized I was walking alone that night. Maybe they heard me talking to myself when I stepped out of my car. Maybe they had been standing somewhere in the fog long before I arrived. Or maybe it was simply bad luck. What I do know is that the experience changed a few of my habits. I stopped lingering near my car after work. I stopped speaking out loud when I thought no one was around. And whenever I walk alone at night, especially when fog fills the air, I pay attention to every sound behind me. Because sometimes the quietest nights are the ones where you're not actually alone. Have you ever encountered someone with such a dark aura that you can instantly tell that nothing good would come out of associating with them? That was exactly how I felt a couple of years ago. My friend Marcus and I attended a wedding in a small coastal town known for its quiet and peaceful shores. I've always enjoyed early morning walks, but that morning, the fog made everything feel off. This happened about 6 years ago, in late September. My friend Marcus and I had been invited to a wedding taking place along the coast in a quiet town called Harbor's Reach. The ceremony was scheduled at a small waterfront venue called Driftwood Point. People always said it was peaceful and perfect for small weddings. Marcus and I had known the groom for years, so there was no way we were missing it. The plan was simple: arrive early, and attend the ceremony, enjoy the reception, and spend the evening catching up with old friends. What we didn't expect was the fog. If you've ever been near the ocean during early autumn mornings, you know the kind of fog I'm talking about. The kind that doesn't just hang in the air, it engulfs everything around you. By the time Marcus and I arrived that morning, the entire shoreline was wrapped in it. You could barely see more than 40 or 50 feet in any direction. At first, no one seemed concerned. The wedding planner assured everyone that the fog would probably lift by mid-morning, which apparently happened all the time along that stretch of coast. Guests continued setting up chairs. The florist was arranging white flowers along the aisle. Somewhere nearby, a small speaker system was quietly playing instrumental music. Oh, it actually felt kind of magical at first. You could barely hear people's conversations from a short distance because the fog seemed to swallow the sound. Marcus and I wandered down toward the shoreline to take a look at the water while the final preparations were being made. "Kind of peaceful, isn't it?" Marcus said. I nodded. "Yeah, strange, but peaceful." We could hear waves rolling gently onto the shore, though we could barely see the water itself. The fog covered the entire bay, blending the sea and sky into one pale grey wall. For the first few minutes, we just stood there listening. That's when we heard it. A steady, rhythmic sound. At first, I assumed it was something from the wedding preparations. Maybe someone was moving chairs or setting up equipment behind us. But after a moment, I realized the sound was coming from the water. It was the slow, repeated dip of oars. Marcus heard it too, and tilted his head toward the fog. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah," I said. It sounded like someone rowing a small boat somewhere out there, just beyond where we could see. That didn't seem unusual at first. Harbor's Reach was a coastal town, after all. People fished these waters, and a few locals had mentioned that small boats passed through the bay regularly. Still, something about the sound was strange. We stood there for maybe a minute, expecting the boat to appear through the fog. Usually when the fog is that thick, people call out so they don't scare anyone. It's just common courtesy near the water. But whoever was out there said nothing. Marcus finally called toward the fog. "Hello?" The sound drifted out over the water, but no one answered. A few seconds later, the rowing continued, but it sounded like the person was hovering around the same spot. We waited another minute, expecting the boat to pass by or change direction, but nothing changed. Eventually, we shrugged it off and started walking back towards the ceremony area. Guests started showing up, shapes moving through the fog before you could even see who they were. But as we walked, we could still hear the sound of someone rowing a short distance away. I glanced over my shoulder and turned back to Marcus. "Is it just me, or does that sound like it's following us?" Marcus frowned slightly, but didn't answer right away. "Probably just the way sound travels over water. Fog can mess with that," he finally said. That explanation made sense. At least it should have. Still, the sound didn't fade away. About 20 minutes later, the ceremony was about to begin. Guests had taken their seats along the aisle facing the water. The fog had thinned just enough that you could see maybe 100 feet ahead. As everyone settled in, things went quiet again. And through that quiet, we heard the rowing sound again. This time, several guests turned toward the shoreline. Even the officiant hesitated for a moment. Then, just for a second, the fog parted slightly over the water. And I saw it. A small wooden rowboat. It was maybe 50 or 60 yards offshore. The boat looked old, dark in color, with someone seated at the oars. The figure was hard to make out clearly. Just a silhouette, really. but there was definitely someone there. And then the fog got even denser, so much so that it was hard to see anything else. When we couldn't see the outline of the boat anymore, Marcus leaned in close to me. "You saw that too, right?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. The ceremony began shortly after that. Music started playing, and the bride walked down the aisle through the fog. For a while, everyone seemed focused on the wedding itself. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed, guests applauded softly. But I noticed Marcus occasionally glancing towards the water. I was doing the same thing. The rowing sound had stopped. At least, we thought it had. After the ceremony ended, people gathered near the shoreline for photos, while the reception area was being prepared further up the bluff. The fog was lifting slowly now, revealing more of the bay. Marcus and I walked down to the sand again. The shore looked calm and empty with no boat in sight. We were just about to head back when Marcus pointed toward the sand. "Hey, look at that." There were footprints, fresh ones, bare footprints leading out of the shallow water onto the beach. You could still see small pools of water collected inside the impressions. Whoever made them had stepped out of the bay not long ago. The footprints crossed the sand for several yards, then turned and followed the shoreline before eventually heading toward a cluster of trees near the edge of the property. Marcus stared at them for a moment. "Did someone from the wedding come down here earlier?" "I don't think so." Curiosity got the better of us. We followed the prints down the beach for a short distance. After a minute or two, we saw something resting against the sand at an angle. A small wooden rowboat, dark-colored. The oars were inside it. Marcus stopped walking immediately. "That's the boat," he said quietly. I was certain of it too. Same shape, same color. The same boat we'd glimpsed through the fog during the ceremony. A trail of wet footprints led away from it, back towards the trees. Marcus grabbed my arm. "All right," he said firmly. "That's enough." "You don't want to see where—" I protested. "No." He shook his head. "We're going back to the reception." Something about the way he said it made me realize he was more shaken by the day's events than he wanted to admit. So we turned around and walked back toward the wedding. By the time we reached the venue, the fog had almost completely lifted. Guests were laughing, music was playing, and servers were setting out trays of food. I glanced back towards the shoreline one last time. The boat was still there, but the person who had been rowing it was nowhere in sight. Even now, years later, Marcus and I still talk about that wedding sometimes. The strange thing isn't that there was a boat in the fog. It's that whoever had been rowing somehow reached shore, walked along the beach, and disappeared into the trees, without anyone at the wedding ever seeing them arrive, and neither of us ever heard the sound of those oars again. I went for the reunion in hopes that spending some time with family and friends would cure my depression. But what I encountered out there sent more chills running down my spine than a rainstorm could. This happened some years ago during a big family reunion in northern Vermont. My partner Lena had been invited to a gathering hosted by her extended relatives at an old countryside estate outside a small town called Pinebridge. The property had been in the family for decades, originally owned by Lena's great-grandparents. Over the years, it had become the traditional place where relatives met every few summers. It was one of those big countryside properties you only really find far outside town. It featured an old farmhouse sitting on a hill, a long stretch of woods behind it, and a narrow lake located at the far corner of the land. It felt quiet, like the rest of the world was miles away. Since many relatives were traveling from far away, people had been encouraged to arrive early and stay for the entire weekend. Tents had been set up near the lake. Folding tables covered with food lined the yard, and a large white canopy stood near the center of the field where everyone would gather for meals and speeches. From the moment we arrived, it felt like one of those relaxed family gatherings everyone had been looking forward to. But there was one strange detail about the weekend. The fog. It had rolled into the valley the night before we arrived and hadn't left since. This wasn't the light mist you sometimes see over lakes in the morning. It was thick, thick fog that hung low and moved slowly between the trees. You could see the farmhouse clearly enough, and the open yard where everyone was gathered, but anything further out faded quickly into grey. The woods behind the property were the worst. Once you stepped past the last line of open grass, you could barely see anything. By late afternoon on the first day, most people were relaxing around the yard. Some relatives were grilling food, others were setting up long tables under the canopy. Lena had gone inside the farmhouse to help organize photos and old albums that the family wanted to display during the reunion. I'm not great with that kind of stuff, so I decided to go for a walk. Behind the farmhouse there was a narrow clearing that stretched into the woods. It wasn't an official trail, just a natural gap between the trees where the ground was open enough to walk through. Earlier in the day, one of Lena's cousins had mentioned that people sometimes used the clearing for short walks when they wanted a break from the crowd. That sounded perfect to me. I told Lena I'd be back soon, grabbed my jacket, and headed toward the trees. The moment I stepped under the first branches, the fog thickened. Out in the open yard I could see 50 feet easily. Inside the woods it dropped to maybe 15. The air felt cooler too, and the sound of voices from the reunion faded quickly behind me. The forest wasn't completely silent. I could hear the occasional bird somewhere above the fog and the soft rustling of leaves shifting in the breeze. But everything felt muffled, as if the fog itself was absorbing sound. At first, the walk was relaxing. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the clearing made it easy to follow a straight path through the trees. I figured I'd walk for 5 or 10 minutes before turning back. Then I heard footsteps. At first, I assumed the sound was my own boots echoing oddly in the quiet woods. But after a few seconds, I realized something strange. The steps were matching mine. Each time my foot landed on the ground, another step seemed to fall at exactly the same moment somewhere behind me. I stopped walking. The forest became still. I turned slightly and called out, "Hello?" The fog drifted silently between the trees. No answer. I waited for a few seconds, listening carefully. When nothing happened, I shrugged it off. It wasn't unreasonable to think another relative had decided to take a walk too. So I continued down the clearing. For a few minutes, everything seemed normal again. Then I heard something else. It wasn't footsteps this time. It sounded like someone breathing heavily. I stopped immediately. My first thought was that someone from the reunion might have wandered into the woods and gotten lost or exhausted. "Hey," I called out. "Is someone out there?" The breathing sound came again. This time I could tell where it was coming from, straight ahead. Through the grey fog, about 20 feet in front of me, I noticed a shape. At first it was barely visible, just a darker patch of shadow in the mist. But as I stared at it longer, it slowly resolved into what looked like the outline of a person standing in the clearing. The person was tall and completely still. "Do you need help?" I asked. I took a few slow steps forward. The strange part was that the person didn't move. That alone wasn't alarming yet. But something else caught my attention almost immediately. No matter how many steps I took forward, the distance between us didn't seem to change. At first I thought it was just the fog confusing my sense of depth. That happens sometimes when visibility is low. So I stepped back, but the person remained exactly where they were. I raised my voice slightly. "Hello." The breathing sound stopped. The person didn't respond. Chills ran down my spine as I watched him in fear. I took 2 steps forward, but the person, whoever they were, didn't give me so much as a side look. That's when things started to feel seriously off. I turned around and started walking back toward the direction I'd come from. At first, I moved calmly, telling myself I was probably misjudging the space between us. After a few seconds, curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced over my shoulder. The person was still there, but it appeared like they were now standing a very short distance away from me. I walked faster and risked another look over my shoulder. They had left where they were standing a few seconds ago, but it would seem that this stranger was trying hard to hide the fact that he's following me. That's when I noticed something else that made the situation even stranger. The lower half of the figure was hard to make out. The fog near the ground was thicker than the air above it, and the shape of the person seemed to fade into that mist. I could clearly see the upper half of the silhouette, but below the waist everything blurred into grey. For a moment, it almost looked as though the person was making some strange signs with his hands. Maybe I was reading into things too much because of my love for horror movies. At that point, my calm walk turned into a jog. Eventually, I saw the faint outline of the farmhouse through the fog ahead. People were still gathered under the canopy. I picked up my pace and ran FTO where several relatives were setting up lanterns for the evening dinner. One of Lena's uncles noticed I looked a little tense. "Everything all right?" he asked. I laughed it off. "Yeah," I said. "Just got turned around in the fog for a minute." I turned in the direction of the woods and noticed that the person following me had turned back. The reunion dinner went on without any problems. People shared stories, kids played games in the yard, and music drifted across the field as the evening went on. Everyone kept mentioning how mysterious the fog made the property feel. Eventually, the gathering came to an end, and people began heading back to their cabins and guest rooms. Just before midnight, I stepped outside the farmhouse for some fresh air. The fog had grown even thicker. From the edge of the yard, the tree line was barely visible. And for a moment, I thought I saw something standing there. Many months have passed since, but even now, when I think back to that trip, I still wonder who that person was. And that brings us to the end of this video. Which of these shocking accounts gave you goosebumps? Let us know in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Deep Horror for more chilling tales such as this one.